Afternoon, comrades. I think we should make a start with the closing rally of this afternoon. There's still a few people coming in, but I think we should get cracking. My name's Jackie Berry. I am a member of the National Committee of Socialist Alternative in England, Wales, Scotland. I'm an intensive care nurse in the NHS, and I'm also a member of the National Executive Committee of Unison, although I'm speaking here, chairing here most definitely in a personal capacity. The pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has plunged the whole world into an economic, social and political crisis. And it is a crisis in which women have been looked to do the heavy lifting. It's been working class women who have been at the forefront of the efforts against COVID-19 in health, in care, in education, in cleaning, in supermarkets. It's our lives that have been put on the line, and none of this is reflected in our pay packets. And women have also been expected to take on much greater responsibilities for childcare, often juggling the demands of homeschooling and remote working simultaneously. So it's no wonder really that women are 17% more likely to suffer mental ill health as a result of the pandemic. The oppression of women is nothing new. In fact, it is endemic to the capitalist system. However, what the pandemic has done is bring into focus, is to shine a light onto the murky, shuddery truths that were harder to see before. Without the labour of working class women, society would collapse. That is true in Britain as it is in Ireland, in Poland, in the US, in Mexico, in Brazil, Argentina, India, or anywhere else in the world. So the struggles of working class women in one country are of a direct relevance to working class women of all countries. And it is in the spirit of international solidarity and socialist feminism that I'd like to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's rally. First, we're going to hear from Devi, a member of Socialist Alternative in Mexico, who will be reporting on the Green Tide movements in Argentina, across Latin America and Mexico. We're going to receive a message of solidarity from Tiffany, who is a Socialist Alternative member in Poland. She can't be here herself this afternoon because there are mass demonstrations taking place in Poland as we speak against the attacks on abortion rights there. Next, we'll hear from Ginger, a member of Socialist Alternative in the US, about the election of Biden and Harris and Trump's legacy and the struggle for working class and women's political representation. We'll also hear then from Faron, a member of Socialist Alternative Sister Section in South Africa, the Workers' and Socialist Party, on violence against women and the struggle in South Africa. And finally, we'll hear from Ruth Coppinger, a representative of our sister organisation, the Socialist Party in Ireland, about the mother and baby homes whitewash scandal and the struggle of Debenhams workers, which has been taking place for a heroic 333 days. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Devi, who will speak probably for 5 to 10 minutes.
Hi, thanks, Jackie. In Mexico, there is a serious problem of violence against women due to all the stigmas surrounding our body, identity, and even the way we relate. Many of the activities that are daily for men, like going out, becomes a journey for us. It is one of the things that you seek to change, to go out without fear, yet is difficult for society to accept or understand because of how the system has been structured. On the issue of violence, we are taught that we must establish the limits because the patriarchal pact will never accept that the blame lies with those who exercise violence. So it is clear where impunity for the aggressors comes from. In Mexico, between 7 and 10.5 femicides occur every day, and at least 51.40% of cases go unpunished, which means that a little less than a femicide in Mexico is punished. In itself, we have always keep in mind that our country is one of the most violent, and the arguments based on this are valid, but this issue change the moment we go out and shoot that our aggressor is our uncle, cousin, grandfather, brother, or friend, because most of the time violence against women comes from people close to us. Only 44% of Mexican women report having suffered violence at the hands of their husband or partner. This figure has increased with the pandemic, since the need to stay at home has been a breeding ground for the increase in domestic and intra-family violence against women and girls, which has increased by up to 60%. Little by little, other types of violence have been squeezed through the movement, and we have won struggles for our rights, such as abortion, which has been part of our slogans in every march and promoted in every country in Latin America. In Argentina, it has been especially significant due to the context and the trajectory that began through the Green Tide that managed to expand throughout Latin America. Battle won for the Argentine sisters when in the early morning of December 30, 2020, and after 12 hours of debate, the archaic Senate of the nation with 38 votes in favor and 29 against approved the law of voluntary interruption of pregnancy. Emotionally and physically costly path in Mexico, since stigma has only allowed it to be legal in only 2 states of the Republic. This, along with other struggles that claim our right to prevent the reproduction of objectification, sexualization, violence, and mistreatment, and that try to take awareness of this to a higher level, have involved practices by the movement that for this society are considered radical, such as the protests at the national level involving iconoclasm, the somewhat recent occupations of the CNDH, and the congresses or the simple national strike of March 9. This for us is not any kind of radicalism, but rather a coherent action that responds to the level of violence we suffer is the minimum. The reproduction of an intolerant and discriminatory ideology from the state, as well as the lack of the questioning about male privilege and gender roles, incite hatred towards women, and it is something that we intend to continue fighting, especially because we are Latinas. We see how we have been the results of this violence. Men in Latin society are not punished for the absence of paternity, nor for their machismo and misogyny. Feminism questions them, and in the face of this question, we are crazy, exaggerate, and no more than the mockery of the internet. But we are more and more visible, and we have the support of women, the public sector, science, the arts with more mothers and not mothers, girls, grandmothers, university students, women with or without a profession who seek to make visible, contribute and fight for these rights throughout Latin America. Thanks to this exaggerated crisis, we have in Argentina the Brisa law, and that guarantees economic coverage for children who have lost of their parents due to gender violence. The Micaela law, which seeks to train all people working in the public sector in gender and violence against women. In Chile, a law against street sexual harassment was passed after a 5-year citizen campaign. In Colombia, femicide is classified as a crime with a prison sentences of between 20 and 40 years. In Ecuador, with the organic law to prevent and eradicate violence against women. In Peru, the law to prevent and punish sexual harassment in public spaces, and legislative decree 1428, which establishes measures to address cases of disappearance. And in Mexico, with the law sanctioning digital harassment or Ley Olimpia. The list goes, and I just want to say that effectively in Latin America, we are the giant because we will not tolerate more violence, and we will condemn it in a social, political, and legislative way until we can go out, love, and choose without fear, warnings, and limitations. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that inspiring report, Debbie. I'm going to hopefully hand over now to a video message from Tiffany from Poland.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me. Last autumn in Poland, we had a massive struggle about abortion rights. Thousands of people, mostly young women, took the streets everywhere in the country. In Warsaw, we had a 100,000 strong demonstration, which was one of the biggest demonstrations in Poland since the fall of Stalinism, if not the biggest. This was in reaction to an attack on abortion rights, which is already very limited in Poland. In October, the Constitutional Court ruled that abortion in case of fetal abnormality was unconstitutional. In Poland, since 1993, legal abortion is limited to cases of fetal abnormalities if the life or the health of the person pregnant is in danger, or if the pregnancy is the result of a rape. 95% of legal abortions are because of problems with the fetus. So the ruling of the Constitutional Court meant almost a total ban on abortion rights. People took the streets against this everywhere in the country, very spontaneously. They demonstrated in front of the churches on the Sunday, and a day of women's strike was called for the next Wednesday. The ruling party, the conservative PiS, threatened with repression. On a speech on TV, Kaczynski, the strongman of the PiS, called for the people to join the far-right thugs to defend the churches. But the demonstrators were already on the next level, and they were not aiming at the churches anymore. The anger was directed directly on the PiS and the government. The slogan "Jebać PiS" was everywhere. This means fuck the PiS. People wanted to overthrow the government, and the PiS really felt threatened. The PiS also used the pandemics to justify repression. It was illegal to call for an event of more than 5 persons. But people took the streets anyway, and it was too unstoppable to be repressed. 100,000 demonstrated in Warsaw. Some little groups of far-right attacked, but they couldn't do anything against such a mass of people. They were ridiculous compared to this mass of people fighting for women's rights. People were chanting slogans in the streets and in the public transport long after the demo was finished. They had the feeling that they had taken the city. I was not at this demo because I live in Krakow, but there too there was an impressive and very energetic demo, and also a feeling that the whole city was once the struggle. The shop workers were on the doors cheering at the demos. Others were cheering from their balconies. There were signs on the shops and everywhere at the windows in support of the struggle. At night there was a smaller protest in Nova Huta, which is a working class district where I live. It had been called by local girls with absolutely no means. They didn't even have a megaphone, but there were hundreds of people with handmade signs. They chanted, "Nova Huta is a woman," because the popular slogan of the feminist movement in Poland is "Revolution is a woman." And it was amazing because there had not been an important protest in this district for the last 30 years. And everywhere in the countries, there were protests that happened in very small towns and in working class districts where nothing ever happens. This really scared the government. Small divisions started to appear within the ruling party between those who wanted more repression and those who wanted to make little concessions. But that wouldn't work anyway, because the main slogan of the struggle was "no compromise." So the peace chose not to implement the decision of the Constitutional Court, and they waited for the movement to just go home. And this happened, unfortunately. This was helped by the lockdown and by the winter, but it also happened because the leadership of the movement did not call for more days of action, and the momentum was lost. The struggle continued with smaller protests on a local level, but there was no more huge demos, even if people were still very angry and still wanted the right to choose. On January 27, the ruling party implemented the ruling of the Constitutional Court, which means that it's no more legal to abort in case of fetal abnormality. There was some reaction, but nothing comparable to what we had witnessed in the autumn. An opportunity was missed. Full abortion rights could have been won if we had a general strike. Workers were discussing the issue at work. A comrade with a rail worker says that his co-workers had said they would go on strike on the question of abortion rights if the unions had called one. A miners' union produced a statement in favor of the movement. There was also support from transport workers, hospital workers, and others. And this is even more impressive when we think that rail workers and miners generally are layers of the working class who are more conservative on women's rights and actually who are generally voting for the conservators. So with the Socialist Feminist campaign Rosa, we agitated for the unions to call for a general strike, which would have been a very powerful weapon. We also called for building strike committees to organize the strike and to vote for a proper leadership representing the movement. This is very important because the bourgeois leadership of the movement is giving up on street action and instead allying with establishment politicians. But to win reproductive rights, we can only count on the independent force of working women and other workers. The bourgeois politicians are only using our rights for their political games. A recent example is Argentina. Abortion rights were in the program of the president, but once elected, he always postponed the legislation. Because he didn't want to anger the conservative layers and the powerful Catholic Church too much, he didn't implement his promise at first. And he had already been elected anyway. So the Argentinians had to fight for a year to actually win this right, and it's only thanks to a mass mobilization that they did. Now in Poland, this is not the end of the struggle. People don't feel like they have been defeated for good, but the movement is looking for a way forward, and also for a proper leadership. So with our campaign Rosa, we continue to advocate for class independence of the movement and to build a link between feminist movement and the workers' movement. And the movement could restart at any moment in Poland if there is a new provocation of the anti-choice side, and we have to get ready. So I hope I will soon be able to talk to you about new developments. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. I don't know why I'm talking to her like she's here, but I very much look forward to hearing from Tiffany about the development of these movements at the upcoming virtual Marxist University in the summer. Our next speaker is going to be Ginger Jetson from the Socialist Alternative section in the US, who's going to be talking to us about the situation there following the election of Biden and Harris, the legacy of Donald Trump, and the campaign to defend the Socialist Alternative councillor in Seattle.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And this event, of course, is super important. I guess I just wanted to start by saying, the health of society can be measured by the degree of equality for women. And speaking from the US, it's even startling for me, the contradictions that exist here in the wealthiest country in human history, the deep callousness of the political establishment and our Congress in Washington, D.C., who play political chess with millions of lives, watering down any legislation to help working people weather the pandemic. They're trying to sell us day after day on proposals that primarily protect the profits of the billionaire class. I read an article actually earlier this week highlighting the 3 best reasons why Americans should live abroad. They said education costs are too high here, housing costs are too high here, and our healthcare system is horrible. In the US, we're home to these phenomenal innovations, booming technology that has changed the world over decades, made life easier in so many ways. But in the hands of the billionaire class and the bosses, it doesn't produce the revolution of everyday life that could lead to fundamental equality for women. And this fact has been so stark in the pandemic, made clear by story after story of essential workers in healthcare fields, which is over 60% or 76% women, thousands of transit workers across the country who provide a hugely important public service are fighting for new contracts right now in their unions, and most still haven't received any hazard pay working through the pandemic. The largely Black and women-dominated postal service, one of the few public services in the US with union rights, good pay and benefits, has faced attack after attack. These were really acute under Trump, but they're continuing now. And the exploitation of grocery store and delivery workers has been exposed by viral TikTok videos of teary and exhausted people at their breaking point. Even the CEO of GoFundMe tweeted that the crowdfunding app cannot replace a robust healthcare system in the US, as the private insurance vultures continue to prey on our losses. All of these workers have struggled during the pandemic, while on the other side, we have the CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and the billionaire class registering over $1 trillion in profits over the course of this pandemic. And I think many of us see and understand how this happens under capitalism, but sometimes I still just don't even believe it, It's no secret that working class women have borne the brunt of this pandemic. And on the one side, women dominate these frontline industries. On the other side, industries dominated by women were the first to disappear as a result of the pandemic and will be the slowest to return, like the service and hospitality industry. And Black and Latino women make up large percentages in both minimum wage workforces that have been attacked and more heavily exploited during the pandemic, and as well in these essential industries. One survey estimated that 2 million mothers have left the workforce, and the New York Times estimates that 1 million mothers quit their jobs because of school closures here. Women's workforce participation has been pushed back to its 1988 level, and this is particularly acute, again, for Black and Latino moms. A recent study showed that nearly 10 million working mothers are suffering from burnout. The lack of childcare is worsening parent-child relationships on a broad scale. And without strong, well-funded social services, millions of parents rely on the public schools in the US for learning, but also for free childcare. More than 30 million children rely on free or reduced price meals at school. And with virtual learning, this means these families are struggling and children are going hungry. In one measure of the viciousness of US capitalism to the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, over 10 million children were officially living in poverty before the pandemic crisis began. And the initial stimulus package actually reduced poverty in the US. One-time checks of $1,200, plus some people, you got money if you had children on top of that. There were top-ups on unemployment, provided massive, but also temporary relief. And now child poverty, the rate is back to near its peak, illustrating the dire need for immediate COVID relief. And a stimulus package was just passed in Congress yesterday. School reopening has been a huge debate here because of the stresses placed on society, because US capitalism wants everyone back to work, and because they aim to break the teachers' unions, attempting to leverage parents' frustrations against the boogeyman of greedy teachers trying to erode their rights and their contracts. But in the recent threat of a teacher strike in the city of Chicago, 80% of parents supported keeping distance learning for a few more months until teachers could be vaccinated and until the COVID cases could come down. And of course, we've registered over 500,000 killed by the pandemic, including thousands of frontline workers who were sacrificed at the hands of the totally inept pandemic response. This has exposed the greed of the billionaire class, but also the deep solidarity of working class people for unity, for militancy in a fight for our rights. And this has to continue if we're to make any long-term changes. Right now, the fight for a union in Alabama at an Amazon worker warehouse could give a tremendous boost to these struggles if it's victorious. Millions breathed a sigh of relief with the defeat of Donald Trump in November. Of course, we no longer have an overtly sexist, racist, xenophobe in office. And we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine rollout going much better right now. President Biden has boldly promised that all adults could be vaccinated by May. But, can we trust Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the Democratic Party? They promised us up and down that $2,000 checks would go out into the mail immediately when they took office. And it turns out that was a lie. Now those checks are $1,400, and in a last-minute capitulation to moderate Democrats, Biden narrowed the number of people who will receive those checks. A key feature of the Biden campaign was raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. He promised this would be his main goal if we defeated Trump. So the Squad, Bernie, and other left Democrats brought a proposal forward as a part of COVID relief bill. And it wasn't a Republican, it wasn't Trump, it wasn't Russian interference, it wasn't QAnon conspiracies that defeated a $15 minimum wage proposal. It was Vice President Kamala Harris, who could have cast the deciding vote on the first package that included a $15 minimum wage. And she didn't use her power to pass it, keeping literally tens of millions of workers in poverty, disproportionately women and people of color. And in the second attempt, pushed by Bernie Sanders, 8 Democrats voted with Republicans against raising the minimum wage. There's almost no better illustration for why working class women cannot trust the Democratic Party and the stark reality of a Biden and Harris presidency that will continue to serve big business. They will drone bomb Syria. They will rebrand, but not end, child detention centers on the border with Mexico. It's true, though, that on first taking office, Biden reversed numerous Trump attacks, including rescinding the Muslim ban, reinstating rights for LGBTQ people in the military, pulling out of the Keystone XL pipeline, and opening a path for an expansive Green New Deal legislation. But look what working class and oppressed people have to withstand in the meantime. The fossil fuel industry is diversifying how it can turn profits from renewable energy, and the dysfunctional, patchwork, privatized energy grid in Texas was wiped out by a single storm. Headlines since have indicated how these private energy corporations are price gouging, sending people bills for $10,000. An individual, a household could get a $10,000 bill right now. And the entire assumption is that dealing with the stress of burst water pipes in your home or these massive bills when nearly 30 million people didn't have clean drinking water and were experiencing power outages, it's assumed that this is an individual problem. This isn't just ludicrous, but it's the actions of a callous ruling class pushing working class people to a breaking point. All of this creates enormous space for the growth of socialist feminist ideas, fighting for a strategy of building movements to win significant change, and the need for a new independent left party for socialists, the labor movement, and the working class that actually fights with a program for the rights of women. Surveys continuously show an openness to socialist ideas, especially amongst young people in the United States. And the massive popularity of the Bernie Sanders campaign last year helped to popularize the idea that we must get organized to fight for massive changes to society. Of course, the campaign was attacked with the Bernie bro narrative since 2016, when it was actually women under the age of 45 who made up the majority of support for Sanders. It was young Native American and Latino women who won Sanders the vote in the Southwestern United States and in the state of California. Young women especially are radicalizing around the fight for climate change, housing, free college, and an end to student debt. There's a mood for rejecting the girl boss feminism that liberal feminists and the mainstream media hammer on us repeatedly. Representation in Kamala Harris and others in the political establishment, is broadly welcomed, but Harris got the nickname Top Cop for her longstanding record of not prosecuting police in the state of California. And I'm speaking to you from the city of Minneapolis in Minnesota, where the National Guard have already been authorized because next week begins the trial of police officer Derek Chauvin, who horrifically murdered George Floyd and sparked the largest protest movement in US history. We may see significant protests again, but it's worth noting that it was the supposedly progressive Democratic establishment that made big promises in Minneapolis to divert the movement for Black lives and fundamentally changed nothing about racist policing in our city. In contrast, in the city of Seattle, Socialist Alternative has an elected council member in Shama Sawant. She's an immigrant and bold Marxist who was elected to fight alongside working class people and build movements to achieve radical change. Within 6 months of first being elected, she led on making Seattle the first major city to pass a $15 minimum wage in the entire country. And this was back in 2014. Remember, the Democrats still refuse. They still refuse to fight for a $15 minimum wage in any real concrete way. Her office has played a key role in winning numerous victories for renters' rights, and in 2019 for a big business tax on Amazon, which is headquartered in Seattle, which will raise hundreds of millions of dollars for affordable housing. And at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, she fought alongside the movement to pass a ban on the violent crowd control weapons that police use, the tear gas, the noise, I forget what they call them exactly, but anyway, the supposedly non-lethal weapons, but that actually have injured and murdered people across the US. She's been targeted by the police, the political establishment, by the right, and by big business CEOs like Jeff Bezos. And this cynical alliance has come together now to attempt to recall her from office, but we're fighting back by campaigning to expand the Amazon tax to fund COVID relief. We're fighting for rent control. We're fighting to campaign in the streets every day to sign up ordinary working class people to build the movement needed to win this program. And I'd urge you to follow the campaign and support by sharing the material on shamasolidarity.org, on our social media, Shama Solidarity campaign on Instagram and elsewhere. And the reality is, this is what a socialist feminist woman of color can do with a Marxist approach. This is the difference. Millions of us are inspired by the squad of progressive socialist identifying Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But without building the movement in the streets to force the vote on Medicare for all, which would mean healthcare coverage for everyone, to force the vote on the $15 minimum wage, to fight back against the Democratic establishment while they squander their majority position. Without building these movements, it's working people who will lose out time and time again. It's not just about getting elected, it's about wielding an office like this to make a material difference in the lives of working class people, especially amongst women, LGBTQ communities, immigrants, and others marginalized by the capitalist system. Socialist feminism doesn't just point out our horrific lack of reproductive rights in the US, or all of the things I've mentioned about the difficulties facing working class women in the US. We don't just point out the gender wage gap and racial inequality. We seek to meticulously organize our class, our coworkers, other working class women, to go after the real looters in society, these pandemic billionaires who are perfectly comfortable under a Biden and Kamala Harris administration right now. Our most urgent task is to strengthen the organizations of the working class. 62% of people in the US believe we need a new third party. The world saw the right-wing mobilization that Trump provoked on January 6th. And so the question is whether that space for a new party gets an answer from the right or from the left. Historically, women are at the forefront of revolutionary struggle. And we anticipate the struggles of the 2020s in the US will be no different, and we will continue to fight to organize the socialist feminist answer, internationalist in its outlook, and taking all opportunities possible to drive for the world needed to end the rule of the billionaire class once and for all.
Thank you, Joan. If you're not sure about how all the vultures in private US healthcare are, you only need to look at what they're doing here in pushing through their program to try and break up publicly owned and provided healthcare. They're not content with just exploiting US workers. No capitalist is contained by their national boundaries, which is one of the reasons it is so important that we have international organisation. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker from South Africa. Her name is Faron, and she's going to talk to us about the movement against gender-based violence that's taking place there. Over to you.
Thank you, comrades. Hello, and thank you so much for having me and to this wonderful event. Okay, so the fight against gender-based violence in South Africa is ongoing. In South Africa, we face two pandemics, like in many places in the world. The coronavirus pandemic, the effects on working class women, I'll explain in a bit. But equally, we face the nefarious pandemic, a scourge of gender-based violence. In 2010, a survey was taken of women in Gauteng, where I am now. It's the province with the largest population and the economic hub of South Africa. And 51% of the women that were surveyed said that they had experienced gender-based violence. And 76% of the men surveyed said they perpetrated gender-based violence at one stage in their lives. And unfortunately, in the last decade, not much has changed. In their 2019-2020 report, the South African Police Force said that over 53,000 sexual offences were reported, an average of 146 sexual offences per day. And that was up from just over 52,000 in the 2018-2019 period. Most of these were cases of rape. Of this, the police recorded 42,289 rape cases in the 2019-2020 period. And this was up from 41,500 in the 2018-2019 period. So that's an average of 116 rape cases reported each day. In that same period, a total of 2,695 women were murdered in South Africa. That means a woman is murdered every 3 hours in our country. According to the World Health Organization, femicide, the murder of women, is 5 times higher in South Africa than the global average. They also reported that in 2016, South Africa had the 4th highest female interpersonal violence death rate out of the 183 countries that they included in their survey. Like in many parts of the world, that kind of interpersonal violence has gotten worse during the pandemic. And in South Africa, we had a very severe lockdown imposed initially. And from when the lockdown began in March 2020 until mid-June 2020, 21 women and children were killed by their intimate partners in South Africa. Within the first week of the lockdown, in March last year, the South African Police Service reported receiving 2,300 calls for help related to gender-based violence. The lockdown has, like it's been reported in other countries, disproportionately harmed working class women in South Africa who face the brunt of both of these pandemics. Of the 3 million jobs lost during the first stage of the lockdown, 2 million were lost by women, and in particular poor women. So 2/3 of the jobs that were lost were women. One study showed that, perhaps unsurprisingly because of the role women play in looking after the household, There were unprecedented levels of household vulnerability, food vulnerability during that time. Half of all the people that they surveyed in that study said that their household ran out of money to buy food in April, so a month after the lockdown was imposed. And 1 in 5 reported said that somebody in their household had to go hungry within the 7 days that they'd done that survey. So most recently, we've had the national budget was announced or reported on, and we saw severe cuts in social spending. And with these recent social spending cuts, working class women are placed in an even more precarious economic position. And this also makes women more vulnerable to gender-based violence. The latest austerity budget increases the burden of childcare, care of the elderly and the disabled, while also decreasing access to social services which are needed when facing potential gender-based violence. So what is to be done? What are we doing? What has happened? In September 2019, there was a huge surge of public outrage and public protests at the brutal murder, rape and murder of a student at the university that I used to attend. And it sort of triggered a nationwide protest against the rising tide of gender-based violence, which is an ongoing topic and often talked about in bourgeois media, and you know, it's highly publicized. And there continue to be sort of sporadic protests and outrage whenever there's a new case of femicide or rape or murder of a woman. There are often protests of young, angry women and young people. So we see that young people are angry with the status quo and are certainly ready to be mobilized as part of a mass movement in the struggle against gender-based violence. There is an immense opportunity for the labor movement and the left to mobilize these young, radicalized women willing to strike and protest to change society. Our task as WASP, the Workers' and Socialist Party in South Africa, is to raise the level of consciousness of working class women and youth to recognize that in order to eradicate gender-based violence, which everybody wants, we need to eradicate class society altogether. These radicalized layers of women, LGBTQI communities, and young people are recognizing the need for collective action to transform society. In one protest last year where we intervened, it was young people, LGBTQI people protesting against gender-based violence and femicide. Even during, no, it wasn't during, I can't remember. Anyway, and I interviewed some of them, and many of the people that I interviewed said that they were ready to strike and occupy to put an end to gender-based violence. So what we need to do, and it's vital, that trade unions actively turn to these layers, take part in these protests and movements as part of reviving an energized youth-led working class movement for socialism. As WASP, we've called for a general strike to take place in the next 3 months, dealing with the effects of the pandemic and fighting so that the working class don't continue to pay for the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of the pandemic. And so we've called for this general strike to take place in the next 3 months, bringing together unions and working class formations that coalesced at the Working Class Summit in 2018, sort of called by SAFTU, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, which is the most militant trade union federation in South Africa, and where we have some key positions. And it's vital that we consciously link workplace struggles with community struggles, including the high rates of violence against women. So SAFTU has committed to launching a national gender commission in which WASP will participate. This initiative presents us with an opportunity to make contact with militant women in the trade union movement, including the young nurses in Durban Trade Union, for example, and others, to connect the struggles of public sector health workers, for example, with the issue of gender-based violence in the country. In our positions within trade unions, we are able to make the argument that to overcome the exploitation of workers, racism, and the oppression of women and LGBTQI communities, we must abolish capitalism. To abolish capitalism, we must unite the working class, female and male, cis and trans, black, white, gay, and straight. And to win genuine freedom for all, we need to build a mass movement with revolutionary leadership and a socialist program to challenge the economic system and the capitalist state. As WASP, we continue to put the Mass Workers' Party on the agenda and push for radical action by the trade union movement, which will include community organizations and youth and women activists fighting for South Africa and a world without gender-based violence, a socialist world free from all oppression. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you so much, Farron. I'm going to hand over now to our final speaker, Ruth Coppinger, who will be talking about the mother and baby home scandal, the Debutants strike, which has been taking place for a heroic 300 and
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and happy International Women's Day tomorrow to all of the socialists and fighters who are on the call. James Conley was one of the founders of the trade union and labour movement in Ireland, as people may know. And he has a brilliant quote about the struggle of women. And the first part of it is that there's none so fitted to break the chains as they who wear them, none so well equipped to decide what is a fetter. And he goes on to say that the entire, trade union movement and working class movement should cheer on women fighting for their rights. And it's just a very inspirational quote, because I think what we're seeing now, as reflected in all of the contributions that have been made, is a worldwide awakening of women, of people of colour, to the oppression that they're facing. As we've seen, as Ginger mentioned, the largest movement that's taken place in US history, Black Lives Matter. And as all of the other speakers have indicated, there's a worldwide revolt against gender-based violence, the like of which we haven't seen before. And what we're seeing in the pandemic as well is so contradictory and interesting, because, as people have said, women are the heroes of this pandemic, in actual fact, being the vast majority of frontline workers in health and education and childcare, and of essential workers in retail and so on. But at the same time are patronised, undervalued and underpaid. Great for the hand claps and applause that we've seen worldwide, but dare you ask for a pay increase or better working conditions or even safety in your school, well, then you're immediately vilified. Interesting to hear what Ginger said about teachers in the US. We've exactly the same situation here in Ireland. And in almost all countries where frontline workers are proven to be so essential, mainly women, it's all of them have struck or tried to get better pay out of the governments that they're now, basically supporting. And I think that we've seen how essential women workers actually are through COVID. And as people have said, women are 3 times more likely to be made unemployed or forced out of work under COVID. And retail, leisure, hospitality, majority female workforces have been most hit. But also race, gender are interacting with class in this pandemic, with Hispanic, Black women being much more likely to be unemployed, and in what's been called and dubbed the she session. And I think in Ireland we've seen very graphically, with the sacking of the Debutants workers, Debutants being a huge international retail joint that you will all on this call be very well familiar with. But in the very early stages of the pandemic, I mean, we hadn't locked down for more than a couple of weeks, so it wasn't due to COVID that they closed. This was an opportunistic tactical liquidation, where they decided to throw off the Irish workforce, the Bangladeshi workforce, and the workforce in Japan all at the same time. And they had manipulated and connived to ensure that they saddled the Irish operation with debt, despite the fact that my local Debutants is actually massively profitable here in Blanchardstown. And they had saddled all of the, they had made Ireland and some other parts of their operation guarantors for huge debt that the directors had undertook. And what we've seen by the Debutants workers has been so uplifting in some ways, because the tenacity that they've shown, having been dumped by email. Some of them have worked for 30 years for this company. You know, some of them have worked lots of them have worked for over 20 years. Many of them are in their 50s. You know, they're nearing retirement. They're going to find it extremely difficult to get other work. Although there were younger workers, obviously there was a lot of older workers as well. And let's not forget, this actually was one of the highest unionized workforces, with a shop steward network that you don't normally get in Ireland. It's something of nearly of the past. And yet their trade union mandate has completely abdicated and stood away from this fight. You know, it's been tokenistic. The workers have had to nearly badger them into action. And it's been completely the agency of these predominantly women workers that have carried this fight up to 332 days today, 333 days tomorrow. I think the tenacity of the workers themselves, who contacted Mick Barry TD, Socialist Party TD in Cork, who contacted myself. And one of the downsides, there's so many downsides to this pandemic, but one of the upsides has been how technology has actually enabled workers to come together in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do before. And at our suggestion, we linked all 11 stores together at a very early stage on Zoom calls in a way that their union never did. In fact, they've never had one generalized phone call with the entire workforce, believe it or not. And we discussed, and it came from the workers themselves, this was at very early stages of lockdown, when people were afraid to go outside the door almost. When there was a limit of 10 at funerals, which there still is, the idea of a protest, of safely protesting in a way that would not lose public support, but doing it in a way that would bring their case out to the general public. And they did so spectacularly with assistance and advice from the Socialist Party in a way that was hugely successful. And the state overreacted. Harassed some of the Debutants workers in the main store in Dublin city centre, and completely and utterly lost public support in the way that they had done it. I think trying to get political pressure on TDs, staging occupations to get to throw off an insulting offer that was being offered to them, using social media. The Debutants workers have been a benchmark and an example for other workers to follow. Now, at a very early stage, we called in the Socialist Party for saving of these jobs, for the government to intervene and stop a massacre that was taking place in the retail sector, a massacre of jobs, sorry, not of people. And that we called for the state to intervene to do so. And we in fact pointed to Ireland is well known for the whole economy resting on foreign direct investment, low or no tax whatsoever on multinationals in many cases. You know, your Googles, your Facebooks, Apple, who can come here and pay virtually nothing. And what would it cost them to maintain these jobs, you know, through COVID, and then to actually reinvest, including the social media and online operation. But of course, that was never advanced by the union. But the demand of saving their redundancies, don't forget, this is people's old age, this is people's retirement that we're talking about here. And the redundancy agreements that they had managed to forge through years of unionisation and struggle were just overthrown completely by Debutants. And that has allowed by the pathetic laws that we have in Ireland. It's allowed to have these type of tactical liquidations. They've happened before, and now they're happening again. And the way to win this struggle is to link together all of the retail workers, most of whom, all the big shops, Dunnes, Tesco, the biggest private sector employer in Ireland is actually Tesco, are all heavily unionised. And yet Mandate have not broadened out this struggle for all women workers, for all retail workers, Pennies, Marks and Spencers. Now we've seen Arcadia tossing their workers off in Topshop, in Dorothy Perkins and Evans, and in all of the other shops as well. And a conscious effort by Mandate to link them together is not even happening, which I think is disgraceful. We've certainly found the ability of the Debutants workers, again, as I said, 90+% being female. And in fact, it's very, interesting that a lot of the male workers didn't take part in this battle at all, actually. Quite a handful, really, in reality. But the kind of sisterhood and the solidarity that they've maintained despite all of the obstacles, I think, has been hugely impressive. Tomorrow, we mark International Women's Day, and the Debutants workers are marking it on the picket lines at 11 a.m. And I think that, the idea of a more unified and powerful struggle that will put pressure on the government to place the workers first in the list of creditors, so as I get some decent redundancy arrangement. The state is actually the first creditor and is paying itself in this, which is incredible, that they're not conceding anything. They've offered the workers 3 million in a training fund that practically every redundant worker in Ireland is offered in any way through the social protection system. And it has been remarked by a lot of workers, they're making the connections between their exploitation as workers and as women. And many of them have remarked they do find it hard to see that 1,000+ male workers will be treated in the shabby way that they've been treated by the government, and in fact by their own union leaders. These are majority women unions, all led by men, by the way. It's same with the teaching unions in Ireland. I don't know if you have the same phenomenon in other countries. And they have found that they've been patronised. They have found that they haven't been taken seriously, and many other things. Now, I think the Socialist Party will continue to support these workers. And we're looking at Mick Barry bringing a bill through Parliament as well that would also increase the political pressure, so we can report that to many of you. I just want to mention something as well that's happened during this pandemic. A lot of people have alluded to what's been called the shadow pandemic of gender violence. In every single country, we've seen a rocketing in violence against women. And in Ireland, what we've seen is the same phenomenon, but we've also seen the coming home to roost of the legacy of the church and state and their interconnectedness in this country, the legacy of the mother and baby homes. In the autumn, the government spoke of, they have not historically dealt with this issue, which still many people are alive, obviously, who were either born in these homes or even were in these homes, forced into them by church stigma and shame for being an unmarried mother. And if it wasn't for the pandemic, I can confidently say that there would have been thousands of people on the streets in Ireland on this issue, including young people. And in October, November, the government spoke about sealing up the records of these homes. And there was a massive public reaction on social media with despite there's a 5 kilometre limit on your right to travel at the moment. So it's extremely difficult for people to protest. And there's limits on the numbers of people that can be outdoors and indoors, obviously. But despite that, there were spontaneous protests at some of the mother and baby homes, organised by people in the community. And recently we've seen a commission that was convened by the government reporting back and absolutely negating the experiences of women and of children in these homes, gaslighting them, trying to say that the crimes weren't so bad. And actually it was the whole of society spread the blame, not pointing the finger of blame at the government and at the church, where it firmly lies. They're the people who stoked up the societal attitudes. They're the people who stoked up the culture of stigma and secrecy. And these institutions are guilty of child trafficking. Tomorrow we have one of the speakers at the Rosa International Women's Day meeting will be a woman who was born in the US, basically trafficked out by the nuns to live in Chicago, in her case, and endured a life of violence and chaos as a result. And, you know, people are still feeling the pain and the after effects of this. And I think that we've seen, you know, this is state violence against women. The whole Irish state was born in violence, and it was born in violence against women as well. Rosa has compiled a huge list of articles that have appeared in the paper just in the last month on issues of gender-based violence, and it's particularly shocking. And I just wanted to kind of conclude my remarks by saying that Rosa, which is a socialist feminist group that was set up by female members of the Socialist Party a number of years ago, in particular to take up the mantle of the abortion struggle in Ireland, but also a whole range of issues affecting women. And the type of feminism that we fight for is a socialist feminism. The feminism that we need has to be a socialist one, because it isn't just about feminizing the elite, as we see by the likes of Kamala Harris being elected in the US, and the lack of difference that unfortunately it's going to make in people's lives. The type of feminism we want is one that looks at the roots of gender inequality and oppression, and looks at the systemic links between capitalism and women's inequality and violence against women. A society that thrives on sexism, racism, and needs division to justify and perpetuate its existence. That's promoted patriarchal structures through its history, that encourages macho culture and rigid gender roles. And capitalism as a system has inequality in its very DNA. The basis of it is to justify inequality and exploitation. The idea that some people are more important than others is an absolute fundamental tenet of capitalism. 82% of all wealth generated last year in the world went to the richest 1%. Billionaires have doubled in the last decade. Oxfam, not known to be a socialist or revolutionary organization, it's a Christian charity, but even it has become radicalized by the horrific inequality and polarizing of inequality that it is seeing. And they've highlighted the gender and race components to capitalism as well, with some stark figures. For example, the 22 richest men in the world have the same wealth as all the women in Africa. The fact that capitalism needs gender inequality is writ large in that statement and that fact alone. And as a system, people have alluded to how capitalism will collapse without the unpaid care work that women do. 10 trillion annually, highlighted by Oxfam. It's linked also to the environmental destruction that's taken place globally as well. Carbon emissions of the top 1% are twice the poorest half of humanity in the last decade. So to try to bring about an equal society where everyone is respected, where nature itself is respected, is impossible without getting rid of capitalism. And what we need is a united struggle of working class people. The working class, as we see now in this pandemic, being the absolute powerhouse in society. Nothing can happen without working class people and workers, linked with women, linked with people of color. We need a multi-ethnic, revolution to take place, united behind the working class. that would usher in a new society that would tackle the culture of sexism and of racism, of violence against women, and of exploitation. So let's work together internationally to bring that type of society about. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, everybody. I would like to sort of bring this event to a close, but first I'd like to suggest that we send a message of solidarity to the Debutants workers in their struggle. It's on my phone, so if you see a thumb, apologies. So I've suggested that we send a message that reads along the lines of: Bread and Roses Festival attendees send greetings to Debutants workers on International Women's Day. We salute the Debutants workers in Ireland fighting their unjust sackings and the re-engaging on their redundancy agreements. Debutants has treated its workers appallingly, also throughout England, Wales and Scotland. We admire the tenacity of the Debutants workers sustaining your strike for 333 days. Here is to victory in your fight for justice for all workers in this pandemic. So if everybody's happy with that, just sort of comment in the chat and we can send that message off. I think this afternoon we've heard a lot of great examples of women fighting back internationally, and I think there is huge potential for similar such movements here in England, Wales and Scotland. Over the last couple of days, we've seen the eruption of anger at the 1% pay offer that's being floated for NHS workers in this country. Because of the sort of protracted second wave of COVID that we've been living through, because of the Tory mishandling of the pandemic and its catastrophic impact, this has caused severe exhaustion on the front line of the NHS, and that severe exhaustion, coupled with the absence of much of a fighting lead from our trade unions, has really dampened the fighting mood. But actually, I think the government have made a bit of a miscalculation with this 1% offer, and in the last couple of days we've seen complete shift in the consciousness of healthcare workers as insult has been added to injury. We're already seeing calls for strike action. Royal College of Nursing are setting up a strike fund, and our call for lunchtime protests to build for strike, to do the prep work to lay the ground for strike action when a formal offer is made, has already been taken up across the campaigners, the NHS Says No campaign. This is a fast developing situation today. There have been protests in London and in Manchester, and one of the organisers in Manchester, the Manchester protest is broken up by police this afternoon. There's been one arrest and the organiser fined £10,000. I think that we should send a message of solidarity to those in Manchester that have been affected. And I think it's a taster really of things that are to come. We've been clapped and praised as heroes, but I don't think that we should be surprised if the ruling class use every tool at their disposal, including their representatives of the state in the form of the police, to break up our action and to undermine support for our cause. But the outrage that is growing, and it is a reflection of the growing political and social confidence that is taking place within working class women. The pandemic and our role within it has compounded a sense that we have sacrificed so much in return for so little. And the pay aspect is, I guess, the economic reflection of this, but it has got social implications as well. I spent a good period of time this afternoon on the phone to my friend whose boyfriend broke up with her. And at the end of the call, she said, "Do you know what? I've been an intensive care sister in a pandemic. I do not need this shit." There is a growing emboldening of working class women, and that needs not just friendly conversations, but it needs political organisation, it needs trade union organisation, and it needs that struggle to be taken up through unions, and it will come up against the obstacles of an inherently conservative trade union bureaucracy, but it also needs a political expression. Most importantly, we need a machine which draws together the threads of women's struggles around the world with worker struggles, the fight for racial and LGBT liberation, into a tool that is capable of a socialist transformation of society. It's not enough to have one councillor or one voice in one parliament in one country. This needs to take place across the entirety of the planet. We really do have a world to win. So if you're on this call today and you're not already a member of International Socialist Alternative, then I urge you to join your local section today. I also urge you to make a donation. Organisations cost money. We have to pay for for full-time staff, for the distribution of our materials, and also to buy a copy of our paper. And I think that there is a link that's going into the chat. And finally, if you haven't had your fill of revolutionary socialism by the internet today, in fact, if this has just whetted your appetite, at 7 p.m. UK time on World to Win YouTube, we will be broadcasting a live show about COVID, the pandemic, and the fight back. So I urge everybody to hop onto that next, and see you soon.